Welcome to the Real Estate Entrepreneurs Podcast.
Welcome to the Real Estate Entrepreneurs Podcast. Today we have an attorney in the house, my friend JJ Childers. How are you doing, JJ?
I'm doing great, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here with you. How are you today?
I'm doing amazing, man, and I'm doing much better because I'm here talking to you now, and we're getting ready to dive into the world of legal real estate. By the way, we're not going to give any legal advice, even though JJ can do it because he's an attorney. This show is for entertainment purposes only. So take the best of what you can and let's go from there. So, JJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, my friend?
Yeah, as you mentioned, my name is JJ Childers. I'm a licensed attorney. I work with a company called Advanced Tax Group. And what we do primarily is we work with individuals, investors, small business owners, entrepreneurs, helping them to, operate their businesses in a way that they know their assets are protected, they have their estate planning in place, and they're paying the minimum amount of taxes legally required. So we're always helping people to identify new strategies, tactics, new legal structures, different ways of structuring their transactions and their business ventures to make sure that they're protecting as much of the money that they're making without unnecessarily paying it to the government or putting it at risk for somebody that wants to sue them. It takes all that. So we work with people from all over the country, primarily with real estate, but we also work with people that just traditional business owners, but we help people to pay the least taxes possible and to make sure that their assets aren't taken in a lawsuit. So that's really what we do. And it's been great to work with you over the years, Ricardo. And I know, speaking at some of your events, I'm excited about the next one coming up here before too long. And great to meet so many interesting and especially just, knowledgeable people that come to those events and being able to share some of the guidance of what we do. Just really enjoyed it.
And I enjoy having you guys around, man. It's you are a good speaker, by the way. You do a pretty good job when you get on stage and engaging people and making them participate and making it to where it's not boring, JJ, because sometimes the legal subject can be one that people might perceive as, hey, let's not talk about that. That's kind of boring, and nobody wants to talk about paying more taxes or less taxes. I mean, everybody wants to pay less taxes, right? But the tax talk can also be perceived as boring, right? And that is not something that looks like that when you're on stage. So I even told Tony, your partner in crime, I said, man, he's good on the stage when it comes to all the legal aspects of it. But in a nutshell, JJ, so what do you think most people getting into real estate, what is the first thing they hear when they join the real estate world is you got to do set up an entity, right? So let's pretend now that for the next maybe 5 minutes, we're going to talk to a newbie that has never done real estate, but is intending to do real estate, and wants to do it safely. So they want to protect themselves, right? As an attorney, what would be the first steps for them to take in order for them to get going correctly?
Well, Ricardo, I'm glad you kind of mentioned it that way, the way that you did. But because I think a lot of times there's kind of misinformation out there. And sometimes it's because there's so much information out there that it's hard for people to really digest it because you hear so much from so many different sources. And it's hard to make that determination as to what's good information, what's bad information, and what should we really kind of factor in. So I'm going to kind of do exactly what you said and just presume I'm talking to a newbie. I know several of the people that watch your podcast have been doing tons of deals. So this is for anybody. But especially starting with a newbie, I always tell people you're going to want to set up a legal entity for your real estate investment activities. And generally what you're going to want to set up is an LLC. Now, LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. And if we really break that down, basically it's pretty straightforward. It's a company that you set up that provides you with limited liability protection. Now, I'm gonna break that down even a little bit, because a lot of times people know, they understand, they know what limited liability is, but sometimes people, they don't, because they start thinking, okay, well, as long as I do everything through my LLC, I'll never have to worry about getting sued. I'll never have to worry about losing any money. Well, that's not necessarily the case. The reality is, the reason you want to set up a separate legal entity, separate and apart from you, is so that you can keep your investing separate. Because what happens is, a lot of times people get into real estate deals, and sometimes those deals don't work out the way they hope they would, or maybe they've got somebody suing them related to the deal, or maybe suing them for things unrelated to the deal. Well, what we want to do is we want to limit our liability for our real estate activities just to what is at stake in that particular company. So I always tell people, first of all, you want to set up that limited liability company, but it's not as easy as that. Because as soon as you try to set up a limited liability company, you're going to have to answer a few questions that you're probably not ready to answer. One of those is, what type is this going to be? Is it going to be a member managed, or is it manager managed? Is it a single member? Is it a multi-member? How is it going to be taxed? Is it going to be set up in the state in which you live? Is it set up in another state? So I'll kind of quickly go through some of these things. First of all, a limited liability company does not have a set way that it is taxed. Whereas, say, if you set up a corporation or an S corporation or a partnership, those are all specific ways of being taxed. When you set up an LLC, there is no guarantee how you're going to be taxed, because first of all, if it's just you, that's a single member LLC, and that's typically what's called a disregarded entity for tax purposes, which means it does not have its own tax ID number. It could have its own tax ID number, but it's not going to have its own separate tax status. It's going to be taxed to you just like a sole proprietorship would. So it'll pass through to you, and you're going to pay taxes just on Schedule C for your 1040, as far as that's how that's going to be taxed. Now, if it's two or more people, then automatically you're taxed as a partnership. Now, what that means is that the LLC itself does not pay taxes, but that doesn't mean there are no taxes due. It just means that the LLC doesn't pay taxes, but it's what's called a pass-through entity, which means the income and the resulting tax liability passes through to the owners, and then they are taxed in their personal tax brackets. So that's going to be a partnership taxation. If it's two or more people, by default, your LLC will be set up to be taxed as a partnership. Now, I'll tell you why that's good. It's good for things such as rental real estate, because for rental real estate, you're not worried about having active income, which would then be earned income that's subject to the FICA tax, because rental real estate, the income is passive in nature, so it's automatically avoids the FICA tax. Now, if you were going to set up maybe an entity for maybe wholesaling or fixing and flipping, that's going to be active income. So active income is also known as earned income. Earned income is subject to that FICA tax, the self-employment tax. And FICA is made up of your Medicare and your Social Security taxes. So those two components add up to 7.65%. And if you're the employee, you pay 7.65%. If you're the employer, you pay 7.65%. Well, when you're in real estate, typically you're self-employed. So you're both the employer and the employee, which means you pay both sides. So now 7.65 times 2, we're talking about 15.3% that's going to be imposed for the self-employment tax. That's not even factoring in just regular income taxes, whether it's state, federal, depending upon what state you're in. So you look at this, and these are pretty big questions that have to be answers and determinations that need to be made right from the very beginning. So I know that's a mouthful, Ricardo.
No, that's good. That's good. I mean, that's a great introduction, right? So, because you're already breaking down the tax liability in between the different models that people tend to follow, right, or to file for, right? So, I remember I was just going with a friend of mine was registered an LLC last week, and he came to me and asked me a question, and he said, "What do you have on yours?" And I was like, "Who cares what I have on mine? Like, you should consult with an attorney that knows how to set you up the correct way, because my way doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna be good for you." So, um, he's like, "I'm just gonna do what you did." I'm like, "No, that's not how I did it. I consulted with an attorney, and they advised me on, you know, going on a multi-member type LLC for the stuff that I'm doing, which is rental properties, which is what you just mentioned. Well, he was registered an LLC for engineering. So an engineer versus a real estate investor, there's two different animals there, right? So I said you need to consult with an attorney within your, what you're going to do as far as being an engineer, because I don't know. I'm not an engineer. So, or nor do I have an engineering firm. Um, so it's good that you're explaining also that, hey, you may pay taxes this way if you go set up your LLC this way, but if you go this other way, it's a pass through, and now that goes to your taxable bracket, which is the earned income that you're actively working for. So, at the end of the day, it's all about selecting the correct vehicle to pay the least amount of taxes, but at the same time to protect yourself.
That's right. And here's the thing. I mean, you gave that example where a lot of people, they say, well, of course I would know that because, an engineer versus real estate. Number one, no, everyone does not know that. But number two, a lot of times people they'll see something like maybe some information online. They did a Google search. They tried to figure out the right way to do things. Depending upon who you are hearing from, that's going to greatly influence the information that's being provided. Because if that person, the professional or otherwise, that's providing that information, they don't know what you do or what your purposes are or your family makeup or how you are implementing this with your estate plan or maybe offsetting it with some other types of legal entities to give you additional protection. These can all work into the mix as far as making that determination. And, that's what I want to hit just real quick as far as, your first question was, if somebody was just getting started, what would I tell them? I'd say, well, go ahead and get that LLC set up. But one of the challenges that people have a lot of time, and you know this very well, because you've got multiple LLCs. Well, the reason you have multiple LLCs is because you've got multiple properties, you've got multiple businesses, you've got multiple industries that you're involved with. So we want to make sure that we separate all those, because sometimes people will think, well, if I just had one limited liability company, I put everything in there. No, now you've put all your eggs in one basket. Something happens to that basket, now all your eggs are at risk of being damaged, if not destroyed. So we've got to make sure that we have an overall approach that factors in all of these things when making that determination. It's going to be unique for everyone, especially because your age is going to factor in there as far as your kids. You may want to do some income splitting with your children, depending upon their ages. And there may be some ways to do that. You may want to tie in where you're more aggressively funding a retirement plan, in which case you may want to take some sort of a salary to beef up that retirement plan, pump that up. And then you can even do self-directed retirement planning through your self-directed IRA, for instance. And then you're able to do things on a tax deferred, if not tax-free basis, which makes it even better. But long story short, everybody needs to take a look at their particular circumstances and have a plan customized for them and their uniqueness.
So I was going to ask you, you mentioned something, and then I said, okay, I got to ask JJ this question. But I mean, you just went on, and now I lost track of it. But I'm going to come back to that question. And let me see if I can remember. It was related to, I don't remember. So I will get back to. I need to start taking notes, JJ. That's what I need to do because I lost the train of thought on the question. And I know that was going to be a good question. So now I got a piece of pen and paper. So when the next question comes up, I'm just going to write it down.
Well, see, I'm just doing so much good stuff at you, Ricardo. It's kind of hard to remember everything.
Yeah, I know. And you went and you just, you just explained like the difference in between why people need to consult with an attorney, right? It's not just going on the Secretary of State and registering an LLC and okay, I'm in business, I'm good to go. And no, sir, because what if you pick the wrong code? What if you pick you don't put the members that are supposed to be in it? Or so this is the question. I had an LLC that was a single member, so it was just me, right? And then I had another LLC that was a multi-member. Both LLCs were sued. And in my name too, my personal name. So they somehow they sue you and your LLCs and everybody. for the same reason, right? Now, the LLC was the company that was doing business, right? They were trying to pierce through the corporate veil, right? Is what it's called. Can you explain what piercing through the corporate veil means? Number one, and this is now more for the more advanced investor, right? And also, why is it that, like, let's say you lose the lawsuit, they can touch the one that's a single member if they find that the member is guilty, okay, or is at fault, but they couldn't touch the one that was multi-member. So there's two questions, right?
Yeah. And
What
I'm
is that?
taking
What is
notes
that?
myself.
Yeah, we have to take notes, JJ, because they
Yes.
will forget. So, what is the definition of piercing through the corporate veil? Number one, and then we'll go to the question that, okay, how come they can touch the one with a single member or the person itself, but not the one that's multi-member? And that depends on the state too, right? Like, maybe different states got different laws.
Yes.
But let's talk in general. It's not state specific.
Okay, so I'm gonna start off by talking about piercing the corporate veil. And if we back up just a little bit and say, okay, the whole concept right here is limiting our liability. So essentially what the law allows us to do is to establish a separate legal entity, separate and apart from us, where we can conduct business, hold assets, own real estate, whatever it is that we're looking to do, separate from ourselves personally. And we can do it in a way that limits our liability, because essentially the premise for this is that the country, the law, the government does not want you to take undue risk that would then end up causing you to potentially have to file bankruptcy or have too much liability out there. So that's why they give us these limited liability options. However, that doesn't mean that they just give this to you and you don't have to do anything in return or in exchange for that. No, there are going to be some fees that you have to pay to the state, and you're going to have certain annual fees that you'll have to pay. That's how they generate income. But you also have to have a certain way of conducting yourself, because this is for business, and this is a business entity for business enterprises. This is not something just as individuals that we can say, tell you what, I am just going to set all my assets over here on the side for just going to get no liability. I'm just going to protection. It doesn't work that way. You have to have a business purpose for this limited liability company. That's why a lot of times people will talk about, say, putting their personal residence into an LLC or something like that. And he said that's not allowed because there's got to be a business purpose. Well, if you're conducting a business and you want to get this business protection, this limited liability protection, you have to act like a business. It's kind of, Ricardo, I tell you, I tell this to people all the time. I say, when I was growing up, I remember this is a strategy my mother taught me, because it seemed like all the time she would say, young man, if you want to be treated like an adult, you're going to have to act like an adult. And I thought I was trying to, and I just wasn't getting the same type of treatment that I wanted because I wasn't acting like an adult.
Right.
It's the same way when it comes to your legal entities. The government is basically telling you, sure, you can get business protection, but if you want to be treated like a business, you're going to have to act like a business. Well, what does that mean? We talk about piercing the corporate veil. That corporate veil is what is described when we say our limited liability protection. We've got a veil based on how we are structured. And even though it's called a corporate veil, it also applies to limited liability companies, applies to partnerships. It's basically saying this protection that we're granted from the government based on our structure, the only way we get that is if we are in compliance with the necessary rules, regulations, laws, and just practices governing these legal entities. So part of that means you've got to have a separate bank account for this entity. You've got to keep separate records. You've got to keep your receipts. You've got to keep separate books. You've got to make sure that you're not commingling funds. And by commingling funds, what I mean by that is that you're not treating this business like maybe a mom and pop grocery store where you got a cash register that, you take the customer's money, you put it in there, and then you just pull it out for your own personal use. You can't do that. You've got to keep everything separate and compartmentalized. And as long as you do that, you will make sure that you continue to have that business liability protection. But if you start acting like you're handling this as a personal asset or it's just a personal account, then they're going to treat it like a personal account from a legal and tax standpoint. Well, what that means is that you no longer get the liability protection, which is why whenever a lawsuit comes about, they're always going to try that as one of their first lines of defense. Because if they can prove that you have not been conducting yourself the way you are required to conduct yourself, then you don't get any protection. So there's no point in even hearing anything about the merits of the case. Now it's just a matter of, hey, if you have liability, it's going to be imposed against these assets for your business assets. So that's the first thing that you asked me about as far as that piercing the corporate veil. And I want to just, when we're talking about lawsuits, I kind of like to distinguish between internal threats and external threats. And what I mean by internal versus external, internal are things that are directly related to the business. So let's say that you've got customers, you've got clients, you've got people that you're interacting with, and something goes wrong in your interaction with your customers, your clients, contractors maybe, and they're suing you based upon that relationship. That's what I call an internal threat. You know, people always talk about maybe if you've got renters and then they get hurt on your property and then they sue you. That's not as common as, you know, some of these other things where a disagreement took place, just maybe with the contractor or maybe with somebody else, and then they file a lawsuit against you. Now they try to take your assets. That's the more common scenario. Or also just maybe you get into a car accident, or maybe your kids get in a car accident, or maybe one of your workers gets in a car. Something happens that's completely separate from your actual business. That's more of an external threat, but they're still going to come after your assets. So when we're looking at those internal versus external threats, you have to have a plan for both types of threats. Just having the LLC in and of itself is not necessarily enough, because you still want to protect your personal assets, and you've got to have an overall structure that will do that. Now let's take a look. You mentioned, I'm presuming this was partly, say, an external threat, because if they sued you personally, your single member LLC, as well as a multi-member LLC, that means they're probably coming after you just in general, personally.
Oh yeah, they were coming after me. It's just that they were trying to find the entities that I have to go put them all up on the same lawsuit.
Yeah. So what they did was they said, okay, now we're going to search maybe the Secretary of State's database or anything tied to Ricardo Rosales. And they're going to say, okay, he's got these different legal entities. Well, we'll add those entities as a way to potentially seek damages through a potential judgment if they won the lawsuit. Now, I'm going to talk about the single member versus the multi-member. Now, in a single member, it's what's called a disregarded entity, as I mentioned, for tax purposes. And there have actually been states that have had to pass supplemental legislation to make sure that there is limited liability offered for single member LLCs. And you correctly pointed out that different states have different treatment for that. Because if you're a single member and you went through all of the effort and expense to actually get an LLC set up, you know, you should get limited liability protection. Well, the rationale between granting limited liability protection for multi-member LLCs versus a single member is that, let's say that you and I were partners, Ricardo, and somebody sues you, and all of a sudden, you know, you and I have a business going, they sue you for something totally unrelated. Now they get a judgment against you, and then they take your ownership in this partnership, for instance. Well, now all of a sudden, I'm adversely impacted by this. I'm hurt because I can't continue to operate my business because I needed the cash flow, those cash reserves, the operating capital. I needed all these things, and now it's been lost through this lawsuit. So under partnership law, they don't allow for that. The remedy is what's called a charging order. So even if they sued you, and even if they won and they got a judgment against you, they can't come in and seize the assets of that partnership. A charging order says that basically now they stand in the shoes of that judgment creditor, or of that judgment debtor, rather, the judgment creditor does. And now they essentially must be treated the same way that that partner is being treated. Well, the good news for us is that through our partnership, through that LLC that we operate together, we can say, you know what? We're not going to distribute any of this money. We're going to keep it inside the company because we need this capital for our ongoing operational expenses. We need it to maybe get some additional real estate. We need it to fix up our current properties that we have. So there are a lot of different
inventory.
Yeah, inventory, all sorts of things. There are a lot of reasons why we can say no. From a business perspective, it's necessary for us to retain this money rather than take distributions. So if you don't take any distributions, there's nothing for them to get. And actually, there's even a revenue ruling from the IRS that essentially said, if they have a charging order and they stand in your shoes, remember, this is a pass-through entity. So even if we don't distribute the income, there's still taxable income. So rather than that going to you, the taxable income that's never distributed, a tax bill would then go to the potential judgment creditor, who would then have to pay your taxes for you if they were in that position. Now, anybody very well versed in asset protection, if they were trying to look at this case, they'd say, I'm not touching that, because they know even if they win, essentially they lose. So that's another, kind of explaining the rationale behind why a single member does not get as good a protection in some instances, but a multi-member can. Is because that charging order. And a lot of states have in their laws, per statute, it specifically says that a charging order is the remedy for LLCs or partnerships. But then some states will even go further to say a charging order is the exclusive remedy, which means that's the only way they can pursue a judgment against an LLC, which is where, at the end of the day, that's where we get the greatest overall asset protection in our overall structure, is from that charging order, which is why we want to have LLCs as part of our overall plan.
That was an amazing explanation there, JJ. So I'm going to ask you another question now. This is more related to real estate, not so much lawsuits and things like that, but from your perspective, what is it better? Because I get this question all the time. Now, I do have a preference for a reason, okay? But I don't know that my reason is the correct reason for having this type of entity, okay? And the question is always, Ricardo, what is it better to hold a property on? Is it on a land trust or an LLC? And I'm like, man, I like land trusts better, because the formation of a land trust is a lot easier for me than it is for the LLC. I'm just talking from a formation point of view. Like, I don't have to go on the Secretary of State and file for, the articles of organization and all that, and pay whatever fee the state charges. A land trust, I have already my trust that I purchased from an attorney at some point, right? But eventually you just cut and paste and you change addresses and names and things of that nature. And the only cost I incur is the notary, basically, that stamps that land trust. Now, from your perspective, JJ, what are the pros and cons in between the two, right? Like LLC versus land trust.
All right. The first thing I would say is, from LLC versus land trust, as far as from the formation standpoint that you mentioned, absolutely. Land trust is much easier, because what you're doing is you're drafting the trust agreement, and it's not filed anywhere. It's not filed with the Secretary of State's office. It's not, doesn't get a employer identification number from the Internal Revenue Service. Basically, as soon as
you can get one.
You can.
Yes.
But typically you're going to just essentially have its own, or the beneficiary, which is, so really what I'm looking at is, I like land trust and LLCs, and I actually like blending them together, so that when you have the trust, the beneficiary of the trust would be an LLC, which is where you get some added asset protection. But what I really like too is, you mentioned earlier, and I know we said we're going to talk more real estate than we are lawsuits here, but at the same time, we've got to be thinking about, when somebody sued you earlier, when they did that search on Ricardo Rosales, part of the reason they knew you had those LLCs is because those LLCs are a matter of public record. That's there. If it was those in Texas, or if it was in another state, but now they know that those are there because Secretary of State's database has all that listed.
Right.
Well, there is no database of these land trusts. So it's, from a privacy standpoint, a land trust is better than an LLC as well. And just an ease of use. Another thing that people deal with a lot of times with real estate is the due on sale clause. Because we had such low interest rates for so long, and then they went up. Hopefully they're coming back down. I don't know if they'll get down as low as they were at one point. We can only hope. But you look at this and you just say, if you're worried about the lender calling your note due and making you refinance and get a new loan at the more bank favorable rates, that's entirely possible. For years we would say, hey, we're not really all that concerned about it, because if anything, the bank doesn't want you to you want to call this note due because it's at a higher interest rate. Well, now they have some incentive to call the notes due if they're at lower interest rates, so that now you have to get a higher interest rate, which makes them more money. But a trust is a specific exclusion to the act that authorizes them to call that note. The due on sale clause basically is the Garn-St. Germain Act, which allowed banks to call notes due because people were essentially doing assumable loans or shifting their loans over to somebody else, and that person would not be as credit worthy. So the banks were saying, hey, we got to have some protection here. So it made sense, but at the same time, it can be abused. It was abused by people trying to abuse the banks, but then it can be abused by the banks trying to take advantage of their customers to impose higher rates. So a land trust enables you to avoid that, whereas an LLC does not. A lender could say, hey, if you transfer this to an LLC, we're going to call your note due. In a trust, they can't do that because there's a specific exclusion in that act that authorized it. So I think I'm probably making a better case for the land trust right now. And part of it is just because, as you mentioned, that ease of use, but also the flexibility and just being able to set one up so easily. And I don't ever have to worry about, I can't tell you how often when we're working with clients, somebody will say, I've got the perfect name for my LLC. And then we search the database and the Secretary of State says, sorry, that name's already taken, or there's a name too similar to that. Well, when you're setting up your trust, you can name it whatever you want to, and you're not worried about that name being taken by some LLC. It's available to you. So it's much quicker, easier, potentially cleaner. There can be more steps involved if you get that LLC as the beneficiary, but I love just the privacy that you get from this as well. So a lot of reasons why a land trust should be absolutely considered.
I love your explanation, and I was it's funny because I was watching last night, and I don't know if it has to do with what you just mentioned, but Saint Germain actually was considered, some people consider him to be an alien. Okay, so I don't know if he's the same guy that we're talking about, and the reason why they consider him to be an alien is because in the 1800s, the guy would not age, and he will run into, like, people will run into him and say, I met you 60 years ago and you still look the same. So I wonder if the Saint Germain Act that you just mentioned has something to do with the guy that I was watching last night on the History channel, like Ancient Aliens or something like that.
I don't know, but we're gonna have to do some research on that.
I'm gonna have to do some research, and it was just the same way you said it, the Garn Saint Germain. So, but they used to call him the Comte of Saint Germain or something along those lines. But yes, you're right. So I just took a property subject to 2 months ago, and I wholesaled it. But I didn't really wholesale the property. I wholesaled the trust. I sold it to a friend of mine. Shout out to Abraham, who's probably watching this podcast at some point or listening to it. And he said, Ricardo, should I take it under an LLC or should I take it under a trust? And I said, look, man, I have my own trust. I can give you access to it since you're going to keep it. If I were you, I would take it under a trust for the privacy, that you just talked about, JJ. And number one, you don't file that anywhere. So the trust isn't filed. Number two, you can change beneficiaries as you please, right? So, and also the trustees, right? You can change those as you please. And number three, you can always set up your LLC for ultimate asset protection if you have it set up correctly. So that's another question. I don't know if he's got it set up correctly because I am not an attorney, but you can probably review his LLC and give him the advice on what he needs to do with it. But having a blend of the two was the answer that I was looking for, because I don't think one replaces the other one. It's just that they should be blended together. But the main reason was for me to give him that advice was for keeping the bank from calling the no due.
Yeah, and that's where I see it a lot is for that particular purpose. But again, the ease, like we talked about, the fact that it's not filed anywhere, Even with a lot of states, they'll require you to do an annual list of officers or members or managers for your LLC or for your corporations, different things. Well, because there's no registry of these trusts, it's not like you have to update who are the beneficiaries, who are the trustees. These things can be changed very easily, which just adds to the flexibility and adds to that privacy as well.
Now, can the government request a list of assets that the LLC owns?
Yeah, well, the government certainly could, as far as if you were involved in any sort of government action, any sort of, if they're doing depositions or interrogatories or anything like that, they can certainly ask for those things. The government's, always the 800-pound gorilla that can pretty much set their own rules for the most part. But this also comes into play. We've just got to factor in the government is rarely going to be involved as far as some of these things. As far as the lawsuits, but these are things that we need to be thinking about. Whoever's coming after us, and a lot of what I tell people all the time is that everyone's worried about getting sued, and you start thinking about this because you say, hey, all the statistics, a new lawsuit filed on average every 30 seconds, 1 out of every 4 people being sued each and every year. You hear about this, and it's very litigious, but at the same time, you've got to think about this: who are they going after? If it looks like you have no assets, or if it looks like you have a lot of debt and not much equity there, that lawyer on the other side, they're taking this case based on getting some sort of a percentage of whatever they win for you or that they settle for you. But if it appears that there are no assets and there's no real money to go after, nothing to get, most lawyers aren't going to even take this case because they say, hey, I want to know that there's a pot of gold at the end of this potential rainbow here. And if there's not, I've got to move on to somebody else. So that's another thing that we do through the overall structuring process is, we may even add a separate legal entity just for funding purposes. So rather than you funding your own deals, you're still funding your own deals, but you're setting up a separate LLC that serves as a funding entity that then loans that money to your operational entity or your investing entity, and then it takes a lien against that property. So you may have your primary financing, with your local bank or whatever lender you're using, but then this would be supplemental financing for the down payment. Well, now if the primary has a lien against your property and then the supplemental also has a lien against your property is fully encumbered. Fact is, it can even be overly encumbered if you have cross collateralization or things like that, where you can say, hey, I want to take a lien against all of your properties to secure this particular debt that you owe me. And when it's our entity, we can do things like that because we can say, hey, this makes business sense. But then anybody looking at us from the outside, it appears that we're underwater. It appears that we're essentially broke. So people don't sue broke people. People sue people that have a lot of money and a lot of easily identifiable money, which is another reason for that privacy that we talked about. If we back up and say, yeah, we've got sophisticated people on here, but we've also got newbies. Newbies sometimes may wonder, why would I need privacy? Well, it's not that you're trying to do anything wrong. It's you're trying to protect yourself from those people that are trying to do what I view as wrong, which is to undeservedly sue you and take any of your assets that you've worked very hard to accumulate. We don't want these suers out here. We've got to make sure that we have a plan to protect ourselves and keep our assets out of the sewers. That's what this is all about, is making sure that you keep more of what you're making, because we all know it's too hard to make to just have it go away. We put our blood, sweat, and tears in here. We want to make sure that we keep what we make.
I love your explanation, JJ. That's so true, and that's why I almost want people to think all the time that I'm completely broke, because hey, there's nothing to sue for, right? So because you just the attorney. So usually before somebody sues someone else, right, they're gonna go consult with an attorney, and the attorney is gonna be like, "All right, tell me who this person is. How much do you think they have? Do they have other companies?" They start asking all these questions to qualify the person that's gonna go get sued. And if the attorney thinks this person does not have any money, Why are you gonna sue this person? What are you gonna get out of it? Well, I just want to bury him under the ground or whatever. I don't care if he doesn't have money, but I'm just gonna go do some damage. Like, you know what, man? You're just wasting your time, because now you're just gonna pay me to sue somebody, because that's what the attorney is gonna do. It's gonna collect a check from whoever wants to sue someone else. At the end of the day, the only one that wins there is the attorney. It's not really the other person or the person being sued. Because if the person being sued is broke and has no assets or no cash or no money, what do they get? What's the worst that can happen? Judgments. And
That's
those
right.
go away after a while. So,
That's true.
and they can actually get wiped out if they counter sue at some point and the other person cannot respond. And, have you seen cases like that where somebody, I don't know, gets a few $1 million worth of judgments and then they all get wiped out for some reason?
Yeah. Now, where I've seen is typically where the judgment will last for a set number of years, and then they realize, hey, this isn't doing anything. And I mentioned that charging order earlier. Imagine getting a judgment, now being in the shoes of the person that you sued, and now you've got to pay their tax bill. You're not going to want to do that very long until you say, you know what, I just want to get rid of all this because I don't want to touch this anymore. Because now not only am I not getting money, it's costing me money. And you hit on a good point earlier when you said that a lot of times people say, I just want to bury this person. Emotion gets involved. And the more the emotion gets involved, that's where people start doing things that don't make any sense. The good thing for this from a lawyer standpoint is that most of these cases would be taken on a contingency fee basis, because most people aren't saying, hey, I had no idea how long this is going to go, how much it's going to cost me. Maybe I'll pursue it for a little while, but if you just try to continue delaying things as long as possible, they're running up a legal tab that they're not going to want to continue to fund and keep fueling this if it doesn't seem like there's any money. Now, that's for those lawyers that would say, hey, I'll keep doing it as long as you're going to pay my bill. Well, that's going to run out pretty quickly. At the same time, if on a contingency basis, that lawyer is not going to take it to begin with, because they're putting forth the money themselves in the anticipation that someday I'm going to reap a giant reward. That's why I'm willing to invest in this. Well, they don't make good money because they're stupid. They make good money because they're pretty sharp, and they have to assess and develop the skill set of assessing, is this going to be a good lawsuit or is it not? Because there's so many lawsuits out there that I could be pursuing. I'm not going to pursue one that's going to be a dead end. I'll just go to somebody else that doesn't have the LLC, that doesn't have any of the protection, that doesn't have all of the things that we're talking about, because that's the biggest mistake that people make, is that they think, I don't ever have to worry about asset protection, so I won't set up these entities. And then now all their assets are at risk. For people like us that set up the entities that then take it to the next level and use trust and other types of multiple entities working with one another and doing different types of structures and strategies, we look weird because we're not even showing up on the radar.
Nothing.
Exactly.
I have a friend of mine, JJ. He's he owns, I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want to throw him under the bus, but he's in real estate and he owns multiple apartment buildings like all over. He gets, every time the IRS issues government checks for some sort of help, he gets it. Like, he's like, this is how poor I look on paper, because of course his attorneys, I'm pretty sure they have advised him on how to set up correctly. But he told me, he was laughing. He's like, man, you remember those $500 COVID checks? I was getting them every quarter or every month. I forgot how long they sent them for. I was getting them too. Don't get me wrong. But that is what asset protection should be like. Like, hey, make me look as if I don't have anything while I still control everything. And I met this one guy from Canada. I'll never forget him. I don't remember his name, and maybe offline sometime when it comes to my mind, I'll mention it to you, because you probably have ran into him at some point. He got sued and he lost all these lawsuits. And next thing you know, he's got millions of dollars worth of judgments against him, right? Well, he figured how to start operating now under a whole different entity with a whole different, EIN. And all he said was, I had to become this other thing, you know. And quickly he realized that, okay, my name is, done, and my social security is all over, all these multiple lawsuits and all that. But that didn't keep me from opening a whole new trust and a whole new entity and a whole new EIN. And now I even have credit on those things, he said, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like how the system can be, I wouldn't say manipulated, because you're not manipulating anything, but you're using all these loopholes, right? And all these things. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like that type of asset protection, right? After you went through something along those lines.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, depending upon the type of entity that you set up, typically when you're setting up, and really depending upon which state you set it up in too, they require different types of information. We set up a lot of Wyoming limited liability companies. So for LLCs in Wyoming, you don't have to even put the person's name as far as on that. You can have an incorporator that does this. There's no record kept of who are the owners. Now, whenever you get your EIN with the IRS, you're going to have to do certain things as far as, who's going to be the responsible party for your taxes, things like that. But you can even set up, say, corporations. Now, C corporation is a completely separate person. And when I say a separate person, I do mean person, a legal person. It has standing in a court of law. It has its own taxpayer identification number. It is its own taxpayer. Remember, we talked about with partnerships, the partnership doesn't pay taxes because the partners pay taxes in their personal taxes, completely separate. Now, I don't always recommend using a C corporation in particular when we're dealing with real estate. However, it can be very, very beneficial as a supplemental entity. It doesn't mean that's your primary entity, but it could be an entity that perhaps provides advisory services. It provides consulting services. So then you can shift part of the money that you're making in real estate, shift it over to that C corporation. Now that's completely sheltered over there, pays its own tax bracket, which may in many instances even be a lower overall tax bracket than you may be as an individual, because right now with taxes, it's flat 21%. Now, I don't know where that's going to go after, the new Congress gets in, if they're going to raise it, lower it, who knows? But right now, that's a pretty good situation to be in. Now, sometimes people will say, yeah, but with the C corporation, you're subject to double taxation.
Right.
Well, you could be, but you can also use that money for business purposes within there. And you could get hit with an accumulated earnings tax, but as long as you have a reason why you're accumulating that money, well, what if you needed it to fund your real estate deals? That's yet another way that we have the ability to utilize a lot of these funds. And you're still, like you said, we're not manipulating, but we are managing. We're managing the rules as they've been dictated to us. Now, talking about getting these checks and different things like that, I've had clients that will have C corporations, and then when their kids were in college, they were able to get Pell Grants. Well, Pell Grants are for people that are lower income, and these folks are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in their C Corp. But on the FAFSA, when they ask you for your information about your financial standing, it doesn't ask for anything with regard to C corporations. So you might be making millions of dollars, but it doesn't even ask you for that. Now you're getting additional financial aid for your kids going to college when you're just following their rules. So there are ways that we can do things, and then through the use of trust that can provide additional privacy, that can then hold the shares of stock, hold the units of ownership. That's why I say it all blends together. It's not just one thing. A lot of times people mistakenly think, okay, which entity is best? They'll ask that question, or I'm only focused on asset protection. And I say, no, you've got to focus on asset protection, tax reduction, and estate planning with all of your activities to make sure that you have the best overall structure rather than this one particular strategy. It's going to be a multitude of strategies in your overall structure.
I know how you close with that, JJ. That was like the best ending that you could have presented today to our people, man. So JJ, I want to thank you, number one, for your time, number two, for your friendship, and number three, for supporting our events. You guys are coming to every single one of our events. Our next event is March 14th and 15th, if I'm not mistaken. Let me double check the dates. And you guys will be there. You guys will be there to answer questions, to help people, navigate the legal world, which is, it can be complicated if you don't understand it. Yeah, 14th and 15th of March. So Houston, Texas, we're gonna have JJ and Tony, who's JJ's partner in crime in Advanced Tax Group. Which, by the way, you guys need to go and check out the website, advancedtaxgroup.com. Let them know I sent you there. You guys do offer free consultations, correct, JJ?
Yeah, we do. If someone just sends an email to info@advancedtaxgroup.com, again, info@advancedtaxgroup.com, and just say, hey, I heard JJ on the Ricardo Rosales podcast. Love to have a consultation with you guys. We offer that, for our special partners, and you are certainly one of those, Ricardo.
And I will be consulting with you guys because I honestly, everything I set up is old already. And I have to get back on track to see where all my things are. And nothing has changed much, but it's always good to take a look at it and fix what needs to be fixed, because there's always errors and problems and things that you're not aware of. And I trust you guys, so I know. And I gotta send my father your way too. He's paying too much in taxes, so um, I know that he can save a pretty penny. So, guys, if you're listening to this podcast or you're watching the video, reach out to JJ and JJ Childers and Tony Dixon. They're they have an amazing company called Advanced Tax Group, and that's what they do. They help guys like me and you and get set up correctly with a correct entity, with the asset protection, what liabilities you need, they'll advise, because we all have different situations and reasons on what may work for me might not work for my best friend. So they do a pretty amazing job at helping people out, and they always come from a good place in their heart. So make sure you reach out to JJ and Tony. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for being here today. The Real Estate Entrepreneurs Podcast. I will see you in March, JJ. Hopefully, I'll see you sooner than that.
Hope so too.
I have to wait until March. So, with that being said, thank you so much. You'll have a great